the forgotten age begins. In the soft hush of a world turning from antiquity to something new, history seems to pause. Empires that once roared across continents grow quiet. In their place, monasteries, crumbling cities, and scattered tribes inherit the weight of memory. This is the moment, somewhere between the fading light of the Roman world and the uncertain dawn of the Middle Ages, when a veil is quietly drawn over the past. Historians later call it the early Middle Ages, roughly between the 5th and 10th centuries, but to many it's simply the forgotten age. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE marks the conventional start. Textbooks often depict this as sudden chaos, but reality was far more subtle. Local elites continued to govern, infrastructure lingered, and trade did not vanish overnight. Yet, something else was happening, less visible but far more lasting. Documents stopped being copied, urban libraries were abandoned, and in this silence, history itself began to thin. A quirky but telling detail emerges from a monastery in Vivarium, southern Italy. In the 6th century, Cassiodorus, a retired Roman statesman, founded a community devoted to preserving ancient texts. But he chose carefully. Some works were copied, others left to rot. What survives of antiquity today is largely what men like Cassiodorus deemed worthy, a quiet editorial hand shaping centuries to come. Scholars still debate whether this was deliberate cultural curation or simply survival triage. Were monks consciously editing the ancient world, or were they overwhelmed by the tide of collapse, saving what they could? Either way, the effect is the same. Vast stretches of knowledge slipped away, unnoticed, like ink fading from parchment. Picture a candlelit room. A monk bends over a page, his pen scratching against vellum. Outside, a storm lashes at broken Roman roads. Inside, he chooses which fragments of the past to keep alive. No grand conspiracy is declared, but decisions made here, in silence, rearrange history for generations. This forgotten age doesn't announce itself. It creeps in like nightfall, first a dimming of light, then a slow engulfing of detail, until entire constellations of fact are hidden behind a dark sky. What remains is the perfect canvas for the biggest cover-up in ancient history to take root. Empires erased overnight. As the candlelight of the Roman world faded, something stranger began to happen. Entire empires and kingdoms disappeared from the record, not gradually, but almost as if someone had taken a blade to the parchment. When modern historians piece together this era, they find blank spaces where bustling civilizations should be. The kingdom of the Vandals in North Africa, for example, a realm that commanded fleets, cities and trade routes, falls to the Byzantine army in 534 CE, and then, astonishingly, almost vanishes from subsequent chronicles. Their laws, literature, and even names dissolve from official history within a generation. Contemporary Byzantine historian Procopius wrote detailed accounts of the conquest, yet later medieval texts reduced the Vandals to little more than raiders, barbaric footnotes in someone else's story. It's as if their empire never existed, their cities, like Carthage, once Rome's rival, swallowed by silence rather than sand. This wasn't mere neglect. It reflected power dynamics. The winners wrote, and the losers were not just defeated, but systematically forgotten. A curious case comes from the Burgundian kingdom, located in what's now southeastern France. For a brief moment in the 5th century, it was a flourishing power, blending Roman and Germanic traditions. Yet when the Franks absorbed it, the Burgundians all but disappeared from mainstream annals. Archaeology shows thriving vineyards, Roman villas still in use, and active trade, but textual history gives us barely a whisper. One chronicler even compressed decades of Burgundian rule into a single dismissive line. Scholars still debate whether this historical erasure was coordinated by central authorities or simply a cascading effect of limited scribal networks and political indifference? Was there a purposeful scrubbing of rival powers, or did records VA? Niche naturally, because those who might have told their stories no longer had the means to do so. Imagine a medieval scriptorium. A monk receives a bundle of old scrolls describing a once mighty Vandal fleet or a Burgundian court poet. He shrugs. These are not his kings, not his saints. The scrolls are set aside, parchment recycled, or simply left to decay. In an age when copying was survival, neglect was annihilation. Modern archaeologists often stumble upon fortified hilltops, collapsed churches, and merchant goods that suggest networks far more complex than the darkness we've been taught. Layers of mosaic floors, imported amphorae, intricate jewellery, all pointing to civilizations that thrived even as their names were scraped from written memory. Empires can be conquered by sword, but to erase them from history itself takes quieter tools: quills, parchment, and indifference. In this section of time, those tools were wielded with startling effect. Overnight, or so it seems to us now, entire people slipped through the cracks, leaving behind stones, coins, and the faintest of echoes. Monks with scissors. Inside the dim halls of medieval monasteries, the custodians of memory sat hunched over wooden desks, scissors in hand, sometimes literally, sometimes metaphorically. These monks weren't just copying history, they were editing it. In the centuries following Rome's decline, monasteries became the beating heart of textual preservation. But in this cloistered world, decisions made by quiet scribes shaped what future generations would call truth. The practice of palimpsesting, scraping old ink off parchment to reuse the material, was common. Parchment was expensive, and ancient texts were often sacrificed to make way for new religious writings. One famous example is the Archimedes palimpsest, a 10th century prayer book that was written over a 3rd century BCE Greek mathematical treatise. For centuries, Archimedes' original work lay hidden beneath layers of devotional text, forgotten until modern imaging revealed it again. Multiply this by thousands of manuscripts, and you begin to sense the scale. In some scriptoria, monks literally trimmed documents. Margins, colophons, even entire sections were cut away to remove what was considered irrelevant or dangerous. A quirky case emerges from a monastery near St. Gall, Switzerland, where scholars found pages that had been carefully sliced to remove Roman legal references, perhaps too pagan, too imperial for a Christian world trying to redefine itself. These weren't acts of vandalism, they were acts of ideological editing. Scholars still debate whether these interventions were centrally directed or simply the product of localized priorities. Were abbots following broader church policies to align history with Christian narratives, or were individual monks deciding on their own which parts of the past deserved to survive? The answer likely lies somewhere in between, in a web of intention and necessity. Imagine the scene. A scribe runs his fingers over an old Roman chronicle. The letters describe forgotten emperors and battles that mean little in his age. He reaches for his knife. With a few careful motions he removes a section, not out of malice but practicality. Over that space he copies hymns that feel more relevant to his time. In that single action, a centuries-old record dies quietly, its absence becoming invisible to future readers. This was not isolated. By the 8th century, major monasteries across Gaul, Italy, and the British Isles operated as editorial hubs. They decided which chronicles, myths, and laws were recopied, reworded, or ignored. The Carolingian Renaissance, often praised for reviving learning, also standardized which texts were circulated, effectively narrowing the historical lens for centuries. Modern historians, equipped with ultraviolet light and spectral imaging, now peel back these layers. Beneath chants and prayers, they find fragments of lost plays, forgotten royal decrees, and astronomical observations inconsistent with the official timeline. These discoveries show that medieval scriptoria weren't neutral vaults. They were filters, shaping how we remember the ancient world. In these quiet rooms, scissors and knives were as powerful as swords. Empires were erased in previous centuries. Here, their stories were edited, line by line, into something new. And the world, centuries later, would inherit only what these monks chose to leave behind. A library in flames. The night the Library of Alexandria burned has long been a symbol of lost knowledge, but fewer people speak of the fire that gutted the Library of Constantinople in 475 CE. This lesser-known catastrophe didn't just consume manuscripts, it shattered continuity. For centuries, Constantinople's imperial library held a vast collection of Greco-Roman texts, imperial decrees, and early Christian documents. When flames tore through its halls, thousands of works were reduced to ash, and with them went a coherent thread of ancient history. The imperial library had been painstakingly assembled since the 4th century by Constantius II and his successors. At its height, it contained an estimated 100,000 volumes, rivaling the great libraries of antiquity. Then, almost overnight, a single accident or act of negligence, sources disagree, obliterated centuries of recorded memory. Later chroniclers mention the fire only briefly, as if unwilling to dwell on its enormity. What remained was fragmentary, scattered across monasteries and private collections. A quirky but haunting detail comes from the Suda, a 10th century Byzantine encyclopedia. It references works, authors, and events no longer extant by the time of its writing, suggesting that the compilers had access to now lost materials, perhaps remnants salvaged from that inferno. The Suda itself reads like an echo chamber of a vanished world, filled with summaries of books that no one alive had seen for centuries. Scholars still debate whether the library's destruction was as total as the silence implies. Some argue that hidden caches of manuscripts survived in imperial vaults, only to be lost later during political upheavals. Others believe that the loss was so abrupt and devastating that Byzantium's intellectual core was permanently weakened, forcing future historians to rely on selective secondary echo, nets rather than direct sources. Picture the scene, a grand hall lined with scrolls and codices, illuminated by oil lamps. A single spark, from a candle, a brazier, perhaps, catches on parchment. The fire spreads silently at first, then roars as dry scrolls ignite in a chain reaction. Within hours, shelves collapse, walls crack, and texts carried from Athens, Rome, and Alexandria are reduced to glowing embers. By dawn, the marble skeleton of the library remains, but its memory is gone. This was more than an archive. It was the backbone of imperial historical consciousness, the reference point for scholars, theologians, and bureaucrats. Its destruction created a vacuum that later generations would fill with fragmented chronicles, biased retellings, or simply silence. It gave enormous latitude to those who came after, monks, emperors, church officials, to reshape the story with less fear of contradiction. Modern parallels exist. Imagine if, overnight, every digital archive, every Wikipedia page, and every university library vanished, leaving only scattered notebooks in private hands. The past would not disappear completely, but the official version could be rewritten with far less resistance. That is what the fire in Constantinople achieved. It didn't just burn books, it set the stage for centuries of selective remembering and deliberate forgetting. The shadow cartographers. Long after flames consumed manuscripts and monks shaped what survived, another subtle hand began redrawing the world itself. Not on parchment filled with words, but on maps. In medieval Europe, cartography was not just geography, it was power. What appeared, disappeared, or shifted on these maps reflected who controlled the narrative of history. Empires that had once spanned oceans began to shrink, migrate, or simply vanish into decorative margins. Take the famous Hereford Mappa Mundi, created around 1300 in England. It's one of the largest surviving medieval world maps, yet it's less about accuracy than theological storytelling. Jerusalem sits at the centre. Empires like Rome are symbolic rather than spatial. The once great cities of North Africa are reduced to vague shapes, while entire kingdoms known from Roman records are absent. It's not that the cartographers didn't know, they were working from manuscripts that had already been edited, burned, or lost. Their job was to draw the world as their age believed it should be, not as it was. A curious example lies in early Byzantine maps of the Mediterranean. Some 6th-8th century fragments show the coastline of North Africa distorted, with cities like Carthage marked incorrectly or omitted. Later maps follow this distorted pattern, suggesting a deliberate cartographic tradition, not a simple error. Why? Some historians suspect this was meant to minimize the memory of rival powers, especially the Vandals, whose naval dominance once humiliated Rome. Others suggest the errors arose because the textual sources feeding these maps had already been censored. Scholars still debate whether medieval mapmakers were consciously participating in historical revision or merely inheriting warped source material from earlier scribes. Did imperial or ecclesiastical authorities issue quiet directives to reframe geography, or did the distortions emerge organically as knowledge decayed? It's a delicate puzzle because surviving maps are few and often copied generations later. Imagine a monk cartographer in a dim stone chamber unfurling a sheet of vellum. In front of him lie fragments of Roman itineraries, biblical references, and oral tales from traders. He must piece together the world from these shards. Carthage? A name whispered but without precise coordinates. A vanished kingdom beyond the Alps? Perhaps better left off. Over time, the act of omission becomes tradition, and the map itself becomes evidence of a new reality. A quirky tidbit: in some medieval Mappae Mundi, mythical beasts fill regions where empires once stood. Dragons where the Vandals had cities, strange men with dog heads, where Roman roads once ran. These creatures weren't just decoration, they were signposts of ignorance, placeholders that told viewers, here lies the unknown, or the forgotten. Modern historians use satellite imagery and GIS software to overlay ancient Roman itineraries on medieval maps. The gaps are startling. Roads leading to major Vandal and Burgundian cities end abruptly, rivers are shifted, kingdoms are replaced by empty parchment. It's as if an entire layer of the world was peeled away, and cartographers dutifully redrew the surface to match a rewritten history. These shadow cartographers didn't shout their changes, they whispered with ink and line, subtly reconfiguring how future generations would imagine the ancient world. Their maps became the textbooks of the Middle Ages, ensuring that what had been forgotten in text was also erased in space. Whispers beneath the basilica, beneath the polished marble floors of Europe's oldest cathedrals, a second world lies in wait. It is not a world of scripture and ritual, but of buried cities, forgotten walls, and chronologies that refuse to align. Over the last 2 centuries, excavations under basilicas, especially in Italy, France, and Germany, have revealed layers that challenge the official medieval narrative. What is whispered in stone below often contradicts what was written in parchment above. Take the Basilica of San Clemente in Rome, a church famous for its architectural time capsule structure. Beneath the 12th century basilica lies a 4th century church, and beneath that the remains of a Roman pagan temple likely dedicated to Mithras. But here's the catch. When archaeologists dated some of the brickwork and coins found in the lowest layers, they noticed chronological gaps. Sections that should belong to the late Roman period appeared anachronistically placed, too advanced for their supposed date, or too early for the structures above. Some scholars have suggested that the sequence of building phases was altered in later records to fit a preferred historical timeline. A quirky example comes from the Cathedral of Trier in modern Germany. Legend claims it was founded by Helena, the mother of Constantine, in the 4th century. But excavations beneath the site in the 20th century uncovered Roman foundations with no Christian layer on top, followed directly by medieval rebuilds. It's as if several centuries' worth of expected intermediate strata were missing, or never existed. Was the Christianization of the site retroactively dated earlier to bolster imperial religious legitimacy? Scholars still debate whether these discrepancies reflect misinterpretations by modern archaeologists, medieval renovations that destroyed earlier layers, or evidence that official chronicles compressed or invented timelines to create a cleaner story of decline and rebirth. None of these possibilities is comfortable. Imagine a team of archaeologists descending into the basilica's crypt by flashlight. Dust floats in the air like ancient breath. They find archways bricked up, corridors leading nowhere, and inscriptions that speak of gods long since struck from official memory. Above them, worshippers recite prayers in a cathedral built on centuries of edited history. The stones say one thing, the chronicles say another. Another striking case is beneath St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. Excavations in the 1940s uncovered a necropolis with tombs predating Constantine's reign, along with structural anomalies that suggest the original basilica's foundations may not match the canonical story of its construction. Some inscriptions mention emperors and dates not found in official papal records. The site is carefully controlled and only limited scholarly access is granted, adding to the mystery. Modern technology is widening these cracks. Ground-penetrating radar and 3D mapping have revealed subterranean layers beneath many medieval churches that suggest lost urban continuity from the ancient world. Cities that official histories claim had crumbled into ruin centuries earlier. Instead, they seem to have persisted quietly, repurposed under the basilicas like whispers preserved in stone. These underground layers don't scream conspiracy. They murmur contradictions, inviting us to listen closely. Beneath the basilicas, the ancient world still breathes, and its pulse doesn't always match the heartbeat set by medieval chroniclers. The emperor's missing years. Somewhere between imperial grandeur and medieval legend, whole reigns seem to stretch, shrink, or vanish altogether. Among the most debated figures in this regard is Emperor Charlemagne, crowned in 800 CE. His reign is often presented as a brilliant revival of Roman order, yet when historians examine the chronology surrounding his era, strange inconsistencies emerge. In some annals his empire expands with impossible speed, in others entire campaigns appear to occur twice, under slightly different dates. There are even stretches of missing years, where records grow thin, contradictory, or suspiciously repetitive. The Royal Frankish Annals, our main source for Charlemagne's life, are a case in point. They were compiled at his court and revised multiple times. Early versions portray him as a warrior king. Later versions elevate him to a near-messianic figure. Curiously, some battles, such as the Saxon campaigns, appear in duplicate with minor variations, as if different timelines were awkwardly stitched together. Scholars like Heribert Illig have famously argued that up to 297 years were artificially inserted into the early medieval timeline, an idea known as the phantom time hypothesis. While fringe, it points to genuine chronological puzzles that mainstream historians acknowledge, even if they reject Illig's conclusions. A quirky example comes from astronomical records embedded in monastic chronicles. A solar eclipse dated to 840 CE in the Annales Fuldenses doesn't match modern astronomical calculations. The event seems to have occurred decades earlier. Either the chroniclers retrodated or postdated events to fit their political narrative, or they were working from a timeline that had already been subtly altered. Scholars still debate whether these chronological oddities stem from scribal errors, deliberate Carolingian propaganda, or more, systemic distortions in how time was recorded during the early Middle Ages. The Carolingian court had immense incentive to present its rulers as direct heirs to Rome, compressing messy centuries into a clean lineage. By reordering reigns and dates, they could make Charlemagne's empire appear like an inevitable successor, not a precarious patchwork. Picture a royal scribe in Aachen, surrounded by scrolls from older monasteries. Some are damaged, others conflicting. His task, to compile a seamless imperial chronicle. Faced with gaps and overlaps, he chooses to harmonize the dates, smoothing irregularities. Over time, these harmonizations become fact, repeated by generations of scribes who no longer question their origins. One of the most striking cases involves Emperor Constantine VII of Byzantium in the 10th century. His scholars produced detailed chronological tables aligning Roman, Biblical, and Byzantine history. But in doing so, they shifted entire reigns backward and forward to make theological prophecies align with imperial legitimacy. Some emperors were granted extra years, others quietly truncated. These changes were presented not as edits, but as authoritative truth. Modern historians use dendrochronology, radiocarbon dating, and eclipse calculations to cross-check reign lengths. The results? A surprisingly unstable timeline between the 6th and 10th centuries. While no consensus supports a massive 300-year insertion, there's agreement that dates were manipulated, sometimes subtly, sometimes boldly, to serve political and religious ends. These missing years aren't just gaps, they're seams, stitches where the fabric of history was pulled tight to fit a new imperial narrative. What we inherit as fixed chronology may in places be carefully tailored illusion, stone that shouldn't exist. Sometimes the past doesn't hide in manuscripts or timelines, it erupts from the ground. Archaeologists have long relied on stratigraphy and typology to date artifacts, but every so often, something surfaces that doesn't belong where it's found. These anomalous stones and artifacts act like quiet rebels, contradicting the official script. One of the most intriguing examples is the Byzantine-style mosaic discovered in southern Spain, dated stylistically to the 6th century, but found embedded within a layer that conventional history places in the 10th century, well into the era of Islamic rule in Al-Andalus. The mosaic depicts imperial iconography, complete with Latin inscriptions referencing an emperor who, according to official records, should not have been contemporary with that archaeological layer. Radiocarbon tests on nearby organic materials supported the later date. It's as if the artifact had leapt across centuries. Another curious case comes from central Germany near Quedlinburg. Excavations revealed Roman-era milestone stones, the kind used to mark distances along imperial roads, but these were found in undisturbed medieval layers. The inscriptions referenced emperors whose reigns didn't align with the surrounding stratigraphy. For decades, these finds were explained away as reused building material, but newer analysis shows no signs of medieval tooling or repositioning. The stones were where they had always been. It was the timeline around them that didn't fit. Then there's the Byzantine lead seal unearthed in a Viking trading settlement in modern-day Sweden. Dated paleographically to the late 7th century, it was found in a layer corresponding to the early 11th century. Either the seal was kept as a family heirloom for over 300 years, unlikely given its utilitarian nature, or chronology had been compressed, placing layers, century, as closer together than traditionally believed. Scholars still debate whether these anomalies are misdatings, results of medieval reuse, or evidence of timeline distortion, either accidental or intentional. Archaeology, after all, is messy. Layers collapse, floods displace artifacts, human activity blurs boundaries. But when dozens of such anomalies accumulate across Europe, each quietly contradicting established chronology, the puzzle becomes harder to dismiss. Imagine a team digging through a quiet Spanish hillside. Trowels scrape gently against tile, a glint of glass, a mosaic edge. As the pattern emerges, the archaeologist frowns. The imagery belongs to a world supposedly 4 centuries earlier. The stratigraphy is clean, the context is clear, yet the stone shouldn't exist here, now. It's a moment that shakes the bedrock of historical certainty. A quirky example involves inscriptions found in southern France referring to a previously unknown imperial title, blending Roman and Christian formulae. Some epigraphers argue these may belong to a phantom emperor, a figure possibly omitted from later records during chronological adjustments in the Carolingian period. Others dismiss it as local imitation, but the stone itself, weathered and unmistakably ancient, sits uneasily in its layer. Modern tools like optically stimulated luminescence, OSL, and advanced stratigraphic modelling are increasingly forcing historians to reconcile these anomalies rather than ignore them. Some researchers speak cautiously of compressed stratigraphy, a phenomenon where centuries may be fewer than we think between some archaeological layers. Others maintain more conservative explanations. But these stones, scattered across the continent, are mute witnesses. They weren't copied, burned, or edited, they simply endured. And their silent testimony sometimes tells a story that official chronicle, as would prefer to forget. The sealed letters. Long before the printing press, power moved through sealed letters, missives that carried imperial commands, papal decrees, or whispered instructions from powerful abbots to their distant scribes. Unlike chronicles or maps, these letters were not meant to endure for centuries. They were meant to shape decisions in the moment, quietly, often away from public scrutiny. And yet, fragments of these sealed instructions survive in archives, monasteries, and imperial repositories. Some of them suggest that the historical record we inherit was not just shaped passively, it was directed. In the archives of Monte Cassino, one of medieval Europe's most influential monasteries, historians uncovered several 8th and 9th century letters instructing monks on which texts to copy, which to correct, and which to abandon. One particularly revealing letter, attributed to a Frankish abbot close to Charlemagne's court, mentions harmonizing the years of the pagans with the years of the Lord, a phrase scholars interpret as guidance to adjust dating systems in copied manuscripts, to align with the Christian calendar reforms then underway. The original documents are fragmentary, but their intent is unmistakable. Official memory was being curated through directives. A quirky case emerges from the Lateran archives in Rome. Among a bundle of mundane administrative letters was a short cryptic note dated to the early 9th century, sealed with wax bearing a papal insignia. It instructed a regional bishop to destroy the double years in the chronicles before forwarding them to the scriptoria. Historians have puzzled over the phrase. Was it referring to duplicate entries, competing calendars, or entire segments of timeline deemed inconvenient? The note never explains, but the language is chillingly administrative, as if excising history was just another bureaucratic task. Scholar Rs still debate whether these letters represent isolated editorial decisions, the broader Carolingian standardization effort, or deliberate historical manipulation. Some see them as pragmatic attempts to align messy local calendars and chronicles across Europe, which varied wildly in their dating systems. Others argue that these directives went further, creating a more streamlined, politically advantageous version of history, especially useful for empires and churches seeking to legitimize their lineage. Imagine a monk in a distant abbey receiving a sealed letter delivered by a weary rider. He breaks the wax, reads the terse instructions, remove duplicate years, harmonize dates with the Lord's reckoning, return copies when finished. He sighs, dips his pen, and begins quietly altering annals written generations earlier. A few scraped lines, a changed date, and centuries later the record will reflect this moment as immutable fact. One of the most telling caches of letters surfaced in St. Denis Abbey near Paris, a Carolingian stronghold. These documents show how abbots coordinated what texts were sent, where, ensuring certain narratives spread widely while others remained confined to local archives, or disappeared altogether. For example, letters show targeted copying of royal genealogies, carefully adjusted to make Frankish rulers appear descendants of Troy, a convenient myth echoing Roman claims. Modern historians, armed with forensic paleography and spectroscopic ink analysis, have traced erasures and insertions in manuscripts that correlate uncannily with these sealed directives. It's as if the letters were remote controls, reaching across Europe to shape the story told in distant scriptoria. Scholars still debate whether this amounted to an organised cover-up or merely the exercise of centralised control in a chaotic age, but either way, these sealed letters show us the hidden command structure behind medieval memory. They were quiet orders, no proclamations, no grand conspiracies, just folded parchment, a dab of wax, and words that reshaped centuries. Calendars rewritten. Time itself is one of history's most powerful frameworks. Change the calendar and you change the story. Between the collapse of Rome and the rise of medieval kingdoms, the way years were counted underwent a transformation so profound that even centuries later, its effects are still being untangled. What looks today like a neat progression from antiquity to the Middle Ages is, in reality, a patchwork of altered, compressed, and sometimes fabricated calendars. The Roman world used multiple dating systems simultaneously, ab urbe condita, from the founding of Rome, consular dating, naming years after consuls, imperial regnal years, and various provincial systems. After Rome's fall, these systems fractured further. Local rulers and monasteries often counted time according to their own reigns, feast days, or even agricultural cycles. Into this fragmented world stepped a 6th century monk named Dionysius Exiguus, whose calculation of Christ's birth gave us the Anno Domini AD system still used today. But Dionysius made at least one critical error. He miscalculated the date of Christ's birth by several years, possibly up to a decade, and excluded earlier dating systems that didn't fit his chronology. A quirky case emerges in England, where Bede's 8th century ecclesiastical history adopts Dionysius's system, but awkwardly tries to align it with earlier regnal lists. Some kings appear to reign before their own birth, others overlap mysteriously. Modern scholars suspect that Bede, revered though he is, massaged timelines to make history fit the new Christian temporal framework. His influence was immense. Later chroniclers treated his adjusted dates as authoritative, cementing distortions for centuries. Scholars still debate whether the widespread calendar revisions were coordinated, especially under the Carolingians, or whether they emerged from a mess, a convergence of local systems being forcibly standardized. Charlemagne's court pushed aggressively for universal use of the AD calendar, not just for religious unity, but for administrative control across his vast empire. By setting a single shared timeline, the empire could present itself as the inevitable heir to Rome and Christendom, a tidy sequence that masked the chaotic reality of post-Roman Europe. Imagine a council chamber at Aachen. Scribes from distant abbeys gather around wooden tables, their scrolls marked with wildly different dates. Some reckon time from their local saints, others from emperors long forgotten. A royal official unfurls a decree. From now on, all dates shall be counted in the years of our Lord. The scribes glance at each other, then at their chronicles. Pages are scraped, margins are adjusted, whole eras are shifted to fit a new temporal map. One of the most striking calendar manipulations involves Easter tables, the complex calculations used to determine the date of Easter each year. These tables were often used as chronological anchors for dating events. Yet when scholars overlay medieval Easter tables with modern astronomical data, they find mismatches spanning decades. Some events could not have happened on the recorded dates because the stars and moons disagree. Either medieval scribes retrofit history to match liturgical calendars, or the calendars themselves were adjusted after the fact, subtly reshaping when key events were said to occur. Modern historians, armed with computer models and astronomical calculations, have found clusters of anomalies between the 7th and 10th centuries. Battles, coronations, eclipses, and church councils appear in sequences that don't align with celestial reality. While mainstream scholarship attributes these to human error or scribal inconsistency, others argue they hint at systemic chronological compression, possibly to align fragmented post-Roman timelines into a single Christianized historical arc. In rewriting calendars, medieval Europe didn't just measure time differently, it bent time. This bending smoothed the jagged edges of history, allowing empires and churches to present a clean, unbroken story, where in fact there had been rupture, improvisation, and loss. The clock was reset, not with fanfare, but with quills, ink, and quiet authority. The monk who counted wrong. Some cover-ups are grand. Others begin with a single miscalculation that echoes for centuries. In the 6th century, a modest scholar-monk named Dionysius Exiguus, Denis the Little, was tasked with recalculating the date of Easter. What he produced would quietly reshape the Western world's timeline. Dionysius introduced the Anno Domini system, counting years from the birth of Christ, rather than from the reign of emperors or the founding of Rome. It became the backbone of medieval chronology, but his math was wrong. Modern scholars have shown that Christ's birth likely occurred between 4 and 6 BCE, based on Roman census data and astronomical clues surrounding Herod's death. Dionysius miscalculated by several years, perhaps misunderstanding earlier Roman calendars or making a simple arithmetic error when converting regnal years. This may seem minor, but when the entire chronological spine of Europe adopted his system, that small error rippled through every dated event thereafter. A quirky example can be found in the Easter tables Dionysius created. These were supposed to align the celebration of Easter with lunar cycles and the supposed date of the resurrection. But historians have noted inconsistencies in his Paschal calculations that affected how later scribes dated major events. Some annals show battles and coronations occurring on liturgical feast days that, according to modern astronomy, don't match the lunar phases of those years. It's as if Dionysius's initial misstep shifted history slightly off its axis. Scholars still debate whether Dionysius's error was purely accidental or if it served a theological purpose. By placing Christ's birth in what he counted as year 1, he effectively erased centuries of imperial reckoning, centering Christian chronology over Rome's. Some suspect this was intentional, a chronological reboot, Severin, the Christian world from the pagan past. Others believe Dionysius was simply a diligent but fallible monk, never imagining his tables would one day structure millennia of history. Imagine Dionysius at his desk in a dim Roman monastery, surrounded by scrolls filled with imperial regnal lists, lunar cycles, and papal decrees. He dips his pen and calculates, line by line, a misread numeral, a mistaken conversion, nothing dramatic, just quiet, meticulous work. Outside, the world remains unaware that the foundational calendar of Western civilization is being built on this moment. The effects of his error became fully entrenched under the Carolingian dynasty, particularly Charlemagne's reforms in the 8th and 9th centuries. Royal scribes standardized the Anno Domini system across Europe, retroactively dating older documents to fit Dionysius's framework. Events from centuries earlier were reassigned to New Year's, compressing and sometimes overlapping timelines. Wars, coronations, and church councils that may have occurred decades apart were repositioned to align with a single Christian temporal narrative. One striking case involves Bede's ecclesiastical history, written in the early 8th century. Bede used Dionysius's system but noted some inconsistencies he couldn't resolve, especially when aligning Anglo-Saxon regnal years with Roman chronology. He ultimately trusted Dionysius over conflicting sources, declaring his system divinely inspired. This decision cemented Dionysius's timeline as sacred, even when evidence contradicted it. Modern astronomical and dendrochronological research has only sharpened the discrepancies. Eclipses dated to specific medieval years don't match celestial records, sometimes off by decades. Scholars who defend the traditional chronology often attribute this to scribal sloppiness, but others see in these mismatches the fingerprints of that original error reverberating through time. It's almost poetic. The world didn't need a vast conspiracy to alter history. One monk counting wrong was enough, and once his numbers became canon, the past itself bent quietly to accommodate them. Chronicles in code. Some secrets are not burned or erased, they are hidden in plain sight. Medieval chronicles, especially those produced in powerful monasteries and imperial courts, often contained embedded codes, cryptic structures, and layered messages. These weren't playful puzzles, they were deliberate ways to encode alternative narratives, preserve taboo knowledge, or signal discrepancies that couldn't be openly stated. One of the most fascinating examples lies within the Chronicon of Thietmar of Merseburg, written in the early 11th century. On the surface, it's a straightforward chronicle of Saxon emperors, but linguistic analysis has uncovered structured acrostics and numerical patterns that seem to reference events not described in the main text. In several places, the initial letters of consecutive paragraphs spell out names of rulers or dates that don't match the accepted timeline. One acrostic seems to hint at a hidden emperor reigning between two Saxon kings, a figure completely absent from official history. Another intriguing case involves Irish monastic annals, particularly the Annals of Ulster. A series of entries dated to the 8th and 9th centuries contain numerical sequences that, when converted using medieval gematria, a system assigning numerical value to letters, appear to encode alternative date reckonings, offset by decades. Some scholars believe these were monks' quiet ways of preserving older, conflicting timelines, while outwardly conforming to Carolingian-imposed chronology. A quirky but telling example is found in the St. Gall Chronicle, where a passage describing a solar eclipse uses odd phrasing that, when read according to classical Latin poetic metre, reveals a second, hidden date embedded in the rhythm. Modern cryptographers have noted that this technique mirrors methods used by late antique scholars to preserve subversive informats, tie-in under censorial regimes. In other words, monks weren't just copying, some were hiding messages inside their texts. Scholars still debate whether these codes represent genuine historical corrections, personal eccentricities, or later misinterpretations. Some argue they were pious puzzles meant to demonstrate erudition. Others, more provocatively, suggest they were ways to flag inconsistencies without openly defying imperial or ecclesiastical authority. After all, a scribe who publicly questioned Charlemagne's official timeline might risk severe consequences. A scribe who embedded the question in verse or number could avoid punishment while still passing a message to future readers. Imagine a dimly lit scriptorium. A monk, aware of the growing discrepancies between the history he's copying and the oral traditions he's heard, tucks a numerical riddle into the margins. He knows most will overlook it, but another learned brother, years later, might catch the pattern, nod silently, and understand. It's a quiet act of resistance, a whisper between centuries. Modern computational analysis has revolutionized the study of these chronicles. Linguists and historians now run pattern recognition algorithms over massive manuscript corpora, uncovering acrostics, chiastic structures, and cryptographic notations previously invisible to human readers. One recent project at the University of Vienna identified dozens of chronological echoes, hidden numerical markers that consistently offset dates by approximately 3 centuries in certain annals. While mainstream historians caution against overinterpretation, the statistical clustering is difficult to ignore. Whether these codes were acts of rebellion, preservation, or clever literary play, they reveal that not all medieval chroniclers were passive conduits of imperial timelines. Some were active participants, aware that what he copied was not always the full truth, and rather than erase, they encrypted, trusting that someday someone would know how to listen. The Phantom Kingdom. Among the most unsettling threads in this tapestry of lost and reshaped history is the story of a realm that may have existed only on paper or been deliberately erased. Historians call it the Phantom Kingdom, though its true name is lost. Its traces emerge like fragments of a dream, scattered in annals, hidden in genealogies, hinted at in maps, where a power once stood between the fading Roman world and the rising medieval empires. One of the most intriguing clues comes from the Bavarian geographer, a 9th century manuscript listing tribes and polities of Central and Eastern Europe. Among recognizable groups like the Moravians and Bavarians, it mentions a powerful entity with many cities and numerous warriors, located somewhere between the Elbe and Oder rivers. But this polity has no other direct mention in surviving chronicles. No king lists, no saints, no clear archaeological capital. It is simply there, once, and then gone. A quirky case arises from a Carolingian charter dated to 822 CE, which references the submission of the ruler of illegible to the emperor. Paleographers examining the damaged text believe the missing name might match the enigmatic polity described by the Bavarian geographer, but the space where the name should be has been scraped clean, the parchment overwritten with a later gloss. Whether by accident or design, the kingdom's identity has been erased. Scholars still debate whether this was a real political entity lost to historical accident, a cartographic error copied across generations, or an intentional deletion. Some posit it was a buffer state between the Carolingians and Slavic tribes, absorbed swiftly and its history deliberately suppressed to simplify imperial narratives. Others argue it never existed, a phantom created by scribal misreading of tribal names, later perpetuated by copyists too reverent to question Tao. Air sources. Archaeology, however, muddies the waters. Excavations in modern-day Western Poland have uncovered urban fortifications and trade goods, Byzantine coins, Carolingian glassware, even Islamic dirhams, clustered in a region where no major medieval power was supposed to exist at that time. Radiocarbon dating places these finds squarely in the 8th to 9th centuries, aligning with the mysterious kingdom's supposed lifespan. The settlement patterns suggest a centralized polity with organized infrastructure, not a scattering of tribes. Imagine standing amid the ruins of one of these fortified sites, moss-covered walls rising from the earth like vertebrae of a sleeping beast. The wind carries whispers of markets, prayers, diplomacy. Yet, in the surviving written record, this kingdom is a ghost, its rulers nameless, its deeds unwritten, its memory scraped from the parchment. One particularly striking clue lies in astronomical chronicles from the Abbasid Caliphate, which mention emissaries from a northern realm between the two great rivers arriving at Baghdad in the late 8th century. No known European power fits this description neatly. Could it have been this lost polity conducting diplomacy beyond the reach of later Carolingian historians? Scholars still debate whether the disappearance of this kingdom's record was deliberate erasure, perhaps to claim its territory as always imperial, or the result of the fragile, fragmented textual culture of the early Middle Ages. But the evidence is tantalizing. Multiple independent sources hint at a significant political actor wiped from the story almost entirely. The Phantom Kingdom forces us to confront a disturbing possibility. Some powers didn't just fall, they were edited out. In a world where scribes controlled memory, erasure could be more final than conquest. What remains are ghost footprints, ruins, coins, stray mentions in distant texts, enough to suggest something real once stood there, something now lost in the shadows between Rome and Christendom, echoes in the stars. While parchments can be scraped and kingdoms erased, the sky keeps its own record. Stars, eclipses, and planetary alignments act like cosmic timestamps indifferent to human politics. By comparing ancient and medieval astronomical observations with modern calculations, historians and astrophysicists can test historical chronologies with surprising precision. And in the period between the 6th and 10th centuries, the stars often don't agree with the official story. One of the clearest examples involves solar eclipses. Medieval chronicles frequently date important events, battles, coronations, deaths, to coincide with eclipses, which were seen as omens. A chronicle from the Annales Fuldenses reports a dramatic solar eclipse in 840 CE that supposedly darkened the sky across the Frankish Empire. Yet modern astronomical calculations show no such eclipse was visible in that year in Western Europe. There was one in 810 CE, another in 879 CE, but nothing in between that matches the chronicler's description. So what happened? Either the chronicler misdated the event, or the timeline itself has shifted. A quirky case comes from Chinese astronomical records, some of the most detailed in the world. Court astronomers meticulously logged comets, eclipses, and planetary conjunctions. When researchers compared these records with medieval European events, they found clusters of mismatches. For instance, a conjunction of Venus and Jupiter documented in China in 710 CE is mirrored by a European account, but the European text dates it to 913 CE. That's a 203-year gap, eerily close to some of the proposed phantom time insertions. Whether coincidence or clue, it's a dissonance written in the stars themselves. Scholars still debate how to interpret these celestial discrepancies. Some attribute them to scribal error, copyists accidentally altering dates over centuries of transmission. Others suggest retrospective prophecy, chroniclers inserting celestial events into narratives to lend divine weight to earthly affairs. But a growing number of researchers are exploring the possibility that chronologies were deliberately realigned, either through calendar reforms or political manipulation, and the stars simply reveal those edits. Imagine a medieval scribe writing by lamplight, describing a solar eclipse to mark a king's coronation. Perhaps he's copying from an older source whose date has been shifted to fit a new Christian calendar. He faithfully records the omen, unaware that future astronomers will check the sky itself and find that the event doesn't fit the year. The stars, like silent witnesses, expose the seams in the fabric of history. One particularly striking instance involves the famous Halley's Comet. It appeared in 760 CE, recorded vividly in Chinese, Arabic, and Byzantine sources. But in some Western European chronicles, the same comet seems to appear twice within a 70-year span, once correctly and once inexplicably during a reign where no comet was due. Scholars argue whether this was a confused retelling or evidence that events were shifted to align prophetic signs with political milestones. Modern technologies have made these discrepancies impossible to ignore. Astronomers now run software simulations to map the night sky backwards thousands of years, confirming exactly where eclipses and comets would have appeared. When these are laid over medieval chronicles, a pattern emerges. Between roughly 600 and 950 CE, European dates diverge from celestial reality more than in any other historical period. Outside this window, medieval records align reasonably well with astronomical data. Scholars still debate whether this represents a systematic chronological distortion or a uniquely messy period of record-keeping. But the stars offer no opinions, they simply show what was. If the timeline was rewritten, intentionally or otherwise, the night sky holds the original draft, and slowly modern science is learning to read it. Architects of amnesia. Behind every edited chronicle and rewritten calendar, there were institutions that depended on controlling memory. The early medieval centuries saw the rise of new power centres, empires, monasteries, and the church itself that understood a fundamental truth: whoever shapes the past commands the future. These were the architects of amnesia, not cartoonish conspirators in dark chambers, but highly organised structures that standardised, centralised, and sometimes sanitised history for political, spiritual, and practical ends. The most obvious example is the Carolingian court, particularly under Charlemagne and his successors. Their vast empire, sprawling from the Pyrenees to Central Europe, needed more than armies to hold it together. It needed a shared narrative. The Admonitio Generalis of 789 CE set the tone. Monasteries were instructed to standardise texts, teach uniform doctrine, and copy approved histories. Local variations, oral traditions, and competing chronologies were to be brought into line. In effect, the Carolingian Renaissance wasn't just a revival of learning, it was a mass editing project. A quirky but revealing detail emerges from the scriptoria reforms spearheaded by Alcuin of York, Charlemagne's intellectual architect. Alcuin emphasised purity of texts and harmony of annals. Under his guidance, manuscripts across the empire were recopied with consistent phrasing and dates. Regional histories that didn't align with imperial chronology were corrected. Even saints' lives were adjusted to fit the new temporal order, with feast days moved to match Carolingian Easter tables. What might seem like clerical tidying was, in practice, a sweeping rewrite of cultural memory. Scholars still debate whether these reforms were politically motivated acts of historical control or simply administrative efficiency in a fragmented post-Roman W's. Ald. On one hand, unifying time and text helped stabilize governance and spread literacy. On the other, it gave imperial and ecclesiastical authorities unprecedented power to dictate what the past looked like. The Church's role was equally profound. By the 9th century, monasteries like St. Gall, Corby, and Reichenau had become hubs of textual production, often acting as de facto historical ministries. Hagiographies, chronicles, legal codices, all flowed through their scriptoria. And because these monasteries often owed allegiance to royal patrons, their output aligned with political narratives. Texts that diverged were quietly shelved or left to decay. This wasn't overt censorship, it was a curatorial silence, a way of shaping memory through what was copied and what was left behind. Imagine a vast network of abbots, scholars, and royal officials exchanging letters and manuscripts. A chronicle from a remote monastery arrives at the court in Aachen. Its dates and genealogies don't match the imperial standard. A royal scholar marks the discrepancies, and a letter returns, correct to the reckoning of the Lord's year. The chronicle is recopied, its oddities erased. The original is stored in a damp archive, forgotten. Within a generation, the corrected version becomes canonical, and the older story fades like ink exposed to light. Another powerful player in this process was the papacy, particularly after the forged donation of Constantine began circulating in the 8th century. This document, which claimed Constantine had given vast temporal authority to the Pope, was later exposed as a fabrication. But at the time it was treated as historical fact, influencing imperial and ecclesiastical politics for centuries. Its existence shows that inventing history could be an instrument of institutional power, crafted not by a rogue monk but by central authority. Modern historians, through paleography, radiocarbon dating, and manuscript comparison, have gradually peeled back these layers of institutional editing. But the scale is daunting. We are not talking about one scriptorium or a handful of letters. We're looking at centuries of coordinated textual standardization, often spanning multiple empires. Whether through conscious manipulation or bureaucratic inertia, the result was the same: a narrowed, controlled historical record. These were not villains twirling moustaches in secret rooms. They were abbots, kings, bishops, builders of schools, defenders of faith, who, knowingly or not, became architects of collective forgetting. They didn't need to destroy all alternative histories. They just needed to define the official one and let silence take care of the rest. The scholars who spoke out. Not everyone accepted the official story. Across centuries, a small but persistent chorus of scholars questioned the timeline, the omissions, and the contradictions embedded in the medieval record. These were not fringe mystics scrawling in the margins. Many were respected chronologists, astronomers, and historians who noticed that something simply didn't add up. Their voices often emerged in cautious tones, wrapped in scholarly commentary or theological reflection, but their message was clear. History had been bent. One of the earliest figures to raise eyebrows was the 16th century Jesuit historian Joseph Justus Scaliger, considered the father of modern chronology. In his meticulous comparison of ancient astronomical records and medieval chronicles, he found inconsistencies in the dating of eclipses and rains. While he ultimately worked within the accepted framework, his methods planted a seed. If celestial events could expose errors, then history itself could be audited. A quirky but revealing case appears in the work of Sir Isaac Newton. Though better known for physics, Newton spent decades on biblical and historical chronology, convinced that the traditional medieval timeline was inflated. He argued that certain ancient kingdoms had been duplicated under different names, effectively lengthening the timeline artificially. Though his theories were controversial, his use of astronomical data to question chronology was groundbreaking, a challenge to centuries of unquestioned dates. In the 17th century, Jean Hardouin, a Jesuit scholar and librarian of the Collège Louis-le-Grand in Paris, went further. He provocatively suggested that many classical texts had been forged by 13th century monks, creating a false antiquity to bolster church authority. Hardouin's claims were extreme, but they stemmed from real textual anomalies he found in man: U-scripts, identical phrasing across supposedly ancient authors, identical marginalia, and stylistic features inconsistent with their eras. His work was swiftly condemned, and he was forced to recant publicly. Yet even his critics admitted he had uncovered legitimate problems with the transmission of ancient texts. Scholars still debate whether these early critics were cranks, visionaries, or both. Some, like Newton, operated within a deeply religious framework. seeking harmony between history and scripture. Others, like Hardouin, were attacking institutional authority directly, but what unites them is their skepticism toward received timelines, an instinct to check the story against evidence, whether astronomical, linguistic, or textual. Imagine Newton in his study, surrounded by star charts, annals, and ancient manuscripts. Candlelight flickers as he cross-references the date of an Assyrian eclipse with medieval European events. His calculations suggest a gap, a missing or duplicated block of time. He doesn't shout conspiracy, he notes the discrepancy carefully, aware that to challenge chronology is to challenge empires and churches alike. In the 19th century, with the rise of scientific archaeology, new voices joined the chorus. Excavations across Europe began to contradict medieval chronologies. Cities once believed to have fallen into ruin centuries earlier showed signs of continued occupation. Coins bearing the faces of emperors not mentioned in texts surfaced from undisturbed layers. Scholars like Friedrich Blumer and Theodor Mommsen began questioning the neatness of the early medieval narrative, noting that the so-called Dark Ages looked less like a void and more like a carefully smoothed-over landscape. A quirky example from this era involves the discovery of the Archimedes palimpsest in the late 19th century. When scholars realized that a Christian prayer book had been written over a priceless ancient scientific text, it confirmed centuries-old suspicions. Medieval scribes had literally overwritten the past. What Hardouin had suggested metaphorically was suddenly visible on the page. Scholars still debate whether modern chronological skepticism, including theories like the phantom time hypothesis, should be seen as legitimate academic inquiry or as fringe speculation. Most historians reject the more radical claims, but few deny that the early medieval period is riddled with inconsistencies, a black box where text, power, and time intertwined in ways we still struggle to fully understand. These critics didn't unravel the cover-up, but they cracked its surface. They reminded us that history is not a monolith, but a negotiated structure, and that even centuries later, the seams can still be found. Modern clues, ancient lies. Today, the past is being re-examined with tools the medieval world could never have imagined. Satellites sweep landscapes from orbit, LiDAR scans strip away forests to reveal buried cities, and algorithms sift through billions of data points. Piece by piece, technology is peeling back the layers of constructed medieval memory, exposing traces of an ancient world that don't always align with the official timeline we inherited. One of the most striking breakthroughs has come from satellite archaeology in Central Europe. In regions once believed to be sparsely inhabited during the so-called Dark Ages, LiDAR has revealed gridded urban layouts, roads, and fortifications, evidence of organized societies that persisted far longer than textual records suggest. In western Poland, near the sites linked to the Phantom Kingdom, archaeologists found the remains of extensive fortresses and market complexes dated through radiocarbon and dendrochronology to the 8th and 9th centuries. Yet no chronicles mention such centres. It is as if they were intentionally left out of the written record. A quirky but revealing example emerged in 2019 when researchers analysing medieval church foundations with ground-penetrating radar discovered anomalously older structures beneath several Romanesque cathedrals in France and Germany. These foundations, sometimes entire buried churches, dated back 2 or 3 centuries earlier than their official founding dates. One cathedral in Alsace revealed stonework and coin hoards from the late 6th century, though records claim the site wasn't built until the 9th. The gap isn't just academic, it challenges the linear story of Christianization and architectural development. Scholars still debate whether these anomalies are evidence of hidden continuity, urban and religious life persisting through a supposedly empty period, or signs that chronology itself was compressed, folding centuries together to fit later political and theological narratives. Some mainstream historians argue these sites show local resilience in an age of fragmentary writing. Others see a pattern too systematic to dismiss as coincidence. Meanwhile, advances in manuscript analysis are revealing edits invisible to the naked eye. Multispectral imaging has uncovered palimpsests and erased lines in countless medieval chronicles. In one case, a chronicle in St. Gallen showed an entire century of regnal lists faintly scraped away, replaced by a shorter sequence that fit Carolingian narratives. Modern technology restored the original undertext, effectively resurrecting a forgotten timeline. This is no longer speculation. We can see the scraping marks, the overwritten ink, the faint ghost letters of the past. Imagine a satellite passing silently over Europe, capturing infrared data of buried Roman roads, snaking through fields labelled Dark Age Wilderness. On the ground, archaeologists follow the trail, unearthing masonry that defies textual expectations. At the same time, in a climate-controlled lab, a technician adjusts the light on a medieval codex, watching hidden Latin lines appear on a screen, lines some monk centuries ago tried to erase. Two very different kinds of light, one from orbit, one from a microscope, converge on the same truth. The official timeline has cracks. A quirky discovery in 2022 added another layer. AI pattern analysis of thousands of medieval documents identified clusters of identical phrasing across supposedly unrelated texts from different regions. Phrasing so specific, it suggests a central editorial hand during the Carolingian period. These linguistic fingerprints appear in charters, chronicles, even saints' lives, as if one editorial office had quietly standardized language across a continent. If true, too, his points to a scale of narrative control far larger than previously assumed. Scholars still debate how far these modern discoveries should push us. Some urge caution, archaeology is messy and anomalies can mislead. Others argue that the weight of evidence, from satellite data to hidden palimpsests, indicates that our medieval timeline is not sacrosanct. At minimum, it's being forced to bend to the evidence, rather than the other way around. What is certain is this: the silence of the past is no longer absolute. Buried cities, overwritten pages, and algorithmic patterns are beginning to speak again, offering clues that the Dark Ages may have been darkened deliberately, not naturally. The cover-up, once hidden behind crumbling monasteries and fragile parchment, is now being illuminated by lasers, AI, and the cold precision of astronomical data. The cover-up unravels. Piece by piece, the once seamless medieval narrative is beginning to fray at the edges. What was long accepted as a natural dark age now looks increasingly like a constructed twilight, shaped by fire, omission, editing, and power. The tools that once rewrote the past, monastic pens, imperial decrees, recalibrated calendars, have met their match in modern science, archaeology, and a new willingness to question the official timeline. Across Europe, archaeological anomalies, celestial discrepancies, and palimpsest revelations converge like lines of ink returning to a faded manuscript. Sites once dismissed as minor tribal settlements are now revealed as thriving urban hubs, operating centuries after they supposedly collapsed. Stone fortresses beneath medieval cathedrals tell of continuities deliberately overlooked, while satellite imagery exposes networks of Roman roads in regions written off as wilderness. The past is reasserting itself against the edits. A quirky, almost poetic example of this unravelling happened in 2021, when researchers applied machine learning to medieval annals. The algorithm, designed to detect chronological anomalies, identified a temporal echo, a repeating 297-year pattern across dozens of Carolingian texts. This pattern eerily mirrors Heribert Illig's phantom time hypothesis, though the researchers themselves remained cautious. Whether coincidence, shared scribal habits, or evidence of compression, the fact that such patterns exist, and had gone unnoticed for centuries, shows how fragile our historical scaffolding can be. Scholars still debate the scale of the distortion. Some argue we are looking at a few decades of misdating, a natural byproduct of medieval chaos. Others propose a more systematic, chronological compression, driven by Carolingian or ecclesiastical reforms that smoothed messy centuries into a linear Christian story. Even those who reject radical revisions admit that the early medieval timeline is riddled with structural problems, missing rulers, duplicated events, celestial misalignments, and archaeological outliers that refuse to fit the official puzzle. Imagine standing in a vast archive. Shelves stretch endlessly, filled with chronicles, letters, decrees. At first glance it seems ordered, a neat timeline carved into parchment, but as you walk deeper, you notice the erasures, the overwritten lines, the repeated phrases. In one corner, a palimpsest reveals an older world beneath. In another, a misdated eclipse opens a window to the sky's silent descent. And beyond the archive, in the soil and stone, the real history waits, patient and unbending. The unravelling isn't about proving a single grand conspiracy. History is rarely so simple. It's about recognising how human hands shape collective memory, intentionally or not. Empires needed legitimacy. Churches needed sacred chronology. Monasteries needed order. In their efforts, they built a version of time that served their present, even if it distorted the past. Today, through interdisciplinary work, combining textual criticism, archaeoastronomy, AI analysis, and ground-penetrating archaeology, we're finally beginning to see through the veil. The biggest ancient history cover-up isn't a single erased kingdom or a lost emperor. It's the quiet, cumulative redirection of history itself, centuries of edits masquerading as inevitability. The cover-up is not a mystery solved, but a story reopened. What was once dismissed as legend, anomaly, or conspiracy is now under empirical scrutiny. The stars, stones, and code of old manuscripts are speaking again, and what they say is both humbling and thrilling. History, like memory, can be rewritten, but never completely erased. Conclusion. As the night deepens and our story draws to a close, we return to where it began. A forgotten age, a silence that once seemed natural, now we know it was anything but. Across centuries, scribes, rulers, and institutions reshaped time, sometimes deliberately, sometimes by accident, leaving us a record both astonishing and fragile. But history has resilience. Beneath basilicas, in the alignment of stars, and within the palimpsests of old manuscripts, the original layers still whisper. The unravelling of this ancient cover-up is not an ending, it's a beginning. Each discovery, each anomaly, each recovered line of text brings us closer to a fuller past, one no longer filtered solely through imperial ink. The Dark Ages may have been written to be dark, but slowly, patiently the light returns,